And my first one is that divorce, we're going to see that divorce divides what God has joined together. My friends, marriage is indivisible, and we're going to see that divorce divides what God has joined together. You see these Pharisees, they come and they ask him the question. The question is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, the Bible tells me that they did this not because they were so concerned about the question, and I can tell you they weren't, because it was a very common thing. Divorce in this day and age with which Jesus is living was a very common thing, even among the religious rulers of Israel. Even among the Pharisees, it was very common for them to be divorced men. But Mark tells us that their clear intention was not that they wanted to know about these things, but that they wanted to test him. And so the spitefulness of the Pharisees here shows little concern for the indivisibility of marriage. They're spiteful. And there's very little concern here given on their part about marriage. Their issue is not, okay, marriage. How do I keep it together? Marriage is supposed to be this permanent thing. How do I keep it together? Their issue is, now let's trap Jesus. Let's trap him. They're not concerned about these things, are they? And so their concern is to test Jesus in order to discredit him among the people. That's the issue. The Pharisees have done this already on a number of occasions, and they will continue to do it, as we are going to see. They want to discredit Jesus. It's not a very popular thing. I can relate to this. It's not a very popular thing to get in front of people and to tell them that, you're divorced, if you got a divorce, you committed a sin, and to even tell them what Jesus tells them, that if you married someone who's divorced, you're committing adultery. I say that now. I imagine that there are probably hearts are saying that, well, you said you're going to be sensitive. That's not very sensitive. And I'm only doing that to make an illustration of the point. It's not an easy thing to talk about. Is it? Or from a biblical perspective, well, I want you to know that uneasiness that you might possibly feel here today would have been experienced in Jesus' day. That's why these guys asked him that question. They were being spiteful and trying to test him. And again, this was a common thing. And as a matter of fact, their leaders were known for divorcing their wives for almost any reason. For almost any reason, quite frankly. But they ask him this question, and Jesus responds, and he answers them and says, well, what does Moses command you? In other words, Jesus says, well, you're asking me? Well, go back to the Bible. You have the Old Testament. You have the Word of God. You go back to the Bible and see what Moses says about this. And so they do, and they tell him Moses permits a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her. It's interesting, in Matthew's account of this, in Matthew chapter 19, verse 1 through 9, it's the same stories here, but Matthew adds some additional details that Mark doesn't for whatever purposes. They're two different writers here telling the same story, but you know how it is when you tell a story. If you tell it from two different people, there's two different perspectives, and one might include details, the other doesn't. But in Matthew's account, he has the Pharisees saying that Moses permits a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her for any reason whatsoever, whereas Mark doesn't include that. But that is nonetheless true. They would divorce their wives for any reason. Now, what are they doing here? But they are quoting the Old Testament. They are actually quoting Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 through 4. They are quoting it, where God actually does acknowledge the existence of divorce within Old Testament Israel. But I want to make the point right off the bat that the regulating of divorce does not deny the indivisibility of marriage. Which is my third point, Mike. Point 2, point 1, A and B. Thank you. That marriage being indivisible, just because God regulates it in the Old Testament does not mean that God puts his stamp of approval upon marriage, or that God in any way, shape, or form is saying that, marriage is something that, quite frankly, it's dissoluble, Just because God does that doesn't mean that God approves it, right? Another example would be slavery in the Old Testament. The Bible actually, Old Testament, deals with slavery, and so does the New. But because the Bible deals with a human institution that's in place, does not mean that it's approving that institution. It's simply trying to limit some of the sinful effects of human beings. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, and I'm going to turn there, and I'm going to read the passage for you. I think it's important to know your Bible. And so Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 through 4, it says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness. Some of your translations actually might say some kind of, not just uncleanness, but some kind of indecency. And if he finds some kind of uncleanness or indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, when she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out, now she's been divorced twice, or if the latter husband died, who took her as a wife, this is the second husband, then the former husband who has divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled, for this is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God has given you as an inheritance. This is the commandment they're referring to. And the purpose of this principle was to alleviate an evil that could not be abolished. The purpose of this principle given, by the way, there's only one command here, and I want to bring this out here, and the command has nothing, it's not about divorce. The command is about a man who is divorced taking his wife back and remarrying her after she already remarried a second time. Do you get that in that? The command's not really relating to a divorce. It does bring up the topic of divorce. But realize that the purpose of the principle here is to alleviate an evil that could not be abolished because mankind's sinful. So God regulating doesn't mean that He denies indivisibility of marriage, but the goal here is actually to protect the wife against a callous expulsion from her home and from her children. You realize this is a day and age which you're writing, they didn't have women's rights like you do in 21st century America. The women were very vulnerable and quite frankly, women, they were treated as, it's not that they weren't loved, but they were treated as property, and to get married was more of a business contract. And it doesn't mean that love wasn't involved. It doesn't mean that at all. But women didn't have an outspoken voice in this time. And it seems that God was seeking to try to protect women, to make the husband think very seriously before he sit there and gets her out of the house.